We have to talk about weed. Let's go. Let's see it.
Cannabis has been vilified to a ridiculous degree for the last century, but
Why
it's
the
now
smoke is
finally
green?
being decriminalized in more and more places around the world.
Decriminalize. Is it saying like that you can't smoke weed wherever you want, or you can't? Decriminalize. Maybe you can.
Just recently been legalized in Germany.
Yeah.
And for very good reasons. Compared to legal drugs like alcohol, which will
Alcohol is not a drug. Shut up.
cause 1 in 20 deaths just this year, cannabis is pretty mild. So, to justify harsh prosecution and punishment, its negative effects have been wildly overstated. Naturally, there was a lot of pushback, and here's something went wrong. If you followed the discourse over the last few years, you might have got the impression that weed has almost only upsides and few, if any, negative side effects. We ourselves contributed to that narrative. What made this worse is that criminalization made it very hard for scientists to study cannabis, especially its long-term
Load of
effects.
crap.
They faced bureaucratic and legal hurdles, and studies often had to rely on small sample sizes. In the last few years, this finally started to change.
What is this
so
stupid
it's
video?
time to bring new evidence to the discussion. And, well, it's not pretty. While weed is still much less harmful than alcohol, it does have a dark side.
Of course.
It is more addictive
Of course
than we
it's more
thought,
addictive.
and
Are you
can have
crazy?
significant negative effects if you use it long term. It seems that
It's like the rate of death is very high with alcohol because people are driving and drinking, so they are dying.
What are you doing? Before you tell us how dumb we are, please watch the video. To be crystal clear, we think prohibition doesn't work and cannabis should be legal, but this also means that we need to treat it as what it is, a drug, with unique upsides and downsides. So let's take an honest look at some of the latest research together. Weed is getting stronger and stronger. Cannabis's magic juice is tetrahydrocannabinol,
Tetrahydrocannabinol, THC.
It docks on your cannabinoid receptors, which affects various brain functions. THC activates
goddamn
some
receptors.
regions and calms down others, creating a fun cocktail of sensations. The more THC, the more intense the high. And people seem
The
to be
THC.
into higher highs, or at least this is what the market is providing. In the US, Canada, and in Europe, the concentration of THC in legal and illegal cannabis products has more than doubled in the last few decades.
Wow.
While ever more potent strains are bred, products like edibles or concentrates with more than 60% THC have become increasingly common, while the share of products with less than 15% THC has declined. Unfortunately, just about every problem weed creates
Forget
gets
about the
worse
THC.
at higher THC doses.
What about the,
At the same time, more
weed
and more people
versus
use
alcohol?
weed. In the US, more people consumed cannabis
They put,
daily than alcohol for the first
brandy
time in
inside chocolates
2022. In Canada,
But it's
26%
very-
of people 16 and older use
very
it,
weak.
up from 22% in 2018. It's not possible to say if legalization is the reason for this, though, since studies are pretty inconsistent and vary massively between different users. In some, consumption went up. In others, it stayed stable, and the trend to use more weed began in the early 90s and sped up in the 2000s, way earlier than legalization. So today, more people consume more weed than ever before in the last century,
That's
and
terrible.
it's the strongest it's ever been.
That's terrible.
What are we seeing as a result of
I
this?
don't know. They all will
Let's
go
start with
to
something
like
that
a
used to get you
psychic
laughed
world.
out of the room: addiction,
Yeah.
weed addiction, and withdrawal symptoms.
Oh no.
A big narrative about weed is that it's not addictive, or at least
course
not
it is.
that big of a deal. And for most people, this is true. Studies clearly show that the majority handle it well. For 8 out of 10 using weed, it's just a casual high and not problematic at all. About 2 in 10 users develop a cannabis
Oh.
use disorder, or
Poor
CUD.
people.
CUD has 11
Oh, well.
different symptoms, from the inability to stop when you've had enough, to using it when you know it will have negative consequences, to tolerance and withdrawal. They can all basically be reduced to you're doing it too often, even if it's bad for you, and it's less fun than it could
Oh
be.
no.
There are 3 major risk factors here: the amount of THC, how often you consume, and your age when you start using cannabis. The more THC, the more often, and the younger you are when you start, the higher your risk. If you smoke too much weed too often, it will have negative impacts on your
You
life.
can't wait there and
So, if this is you, toning it down a bit will make a big difference.
How can you
One in
afford the
10
weed?
users develops a serious addiction. They usually consume daily, and their life is significantly impaired or held back
Holy
because
shit.
they spend a lot of their time either using
Holy
or
shit.
recovering from cannabis use. Since their brain is building a tolerance, they need increasingly high doses or stronger weed, often
The room
both.
is clean.
Studies found a variety of negative effects. Heavy users can experience bad moods, feel irritable, restless, paranoid, anxious, and even depressive.
Paranoid.
In a
Anxious.
sad twist of irony, for many addicts it feels like they need weed to fight these symptoms. Maybe it did actually help at first, while in reality it makes those symptoms stronger and more persistent. Studies also found that loneliness and frequent cannabis use go hand in hand.
Yeah.
If you feel lonely, you're more likely to use weed, and if you use weed, you may experience more loneliness.
That's
It's not
terrible.
always easy to say which came first, but they seem to reinforce each other.
That's
So,
terrible.
on the one hand, cannabis makes loneliness feel much less bad. On the other hand, it can also make you feel more socially awkward than
Leave
you
me
actually
alone.
are and withdraw from friends. This can lead to a downward spiral that ends in self-isolation and chronic loneliness. Another thing many people who consume a lot experience is a mental numbness that makes boredom feel okay because it impacts the reward
Wow.
system of your brain.
Wow.
Not great, but good enough. You can spend your days killing time binging mildly interesting stuff, being numb rather than having fun.
That's terrible.
Boredom is a signal to your mind to get creative or learn something
Yeah.
new, but this is suppressed. This also makes quitting so much harder because your daily routines suddenly seem boring and unexciting, making it very tempting to go back. If you find yourself using constantly, this can also stunt your
Well,
development as a
you can't
person.
hear those stuff
The
about
numbness
alcohol,
dulls
right?
bad feelings, making it easy not to deal with them. But in life, you can only get over bad feelings if you actually feel them, and you have to process them to grow. Lastly, let's talk about physical withdrawal symptoms. The more you consume, the worse they'll be for you,
Pile of shit.
especially if you use daily. Withdrawal can cause headaches and sweating or chills, decreased appetite,
All the
in
usual
severe
suspects.
cases even fever, nausea and abdominal pain. You might have trouble falling asleep, and if you do, you might have disturbing and vivid
Ugh.
dreams. The withdrawal can put you in a depressive mood where life feels daft and pointless.
Everything
You
pointless.
can feel restless, angry, anxious, or nervous. You may feel unable to do anything at all. After a few days,
That's
these
terrible.
symptoms will begin to subside, and after a few weeks, they'll be gone entirely.
That's amazing
The
that after a
exact
few
time
days,
depends
you
on
just
how
need those
much and
few
how
days
long
and
you've
then
been
you're done.
consuming cannabis. Now, let's get to the worst part.
What?
Weed may damage your brain.
Oh no.
This section was not fun to research because there's fierce debate among researchers
Because the guy that did the research, he had a lot of weed, so he couldn't complete the research.
how bad weed is for your brain and whether it has irreversible long-term consequences or not. There's no consensus yet, and it's hard to say anything definitive. Having said that, THC directly interferes with critical brain chemistry. There is some evidence that it may alter its structure. If it does, this may go away again if you quit after a few years, or not. We don't know yet. The consequences vary a lot between individuals, but especially for heavy users, they have a variety of potentially unfunny downsides. The most common one is that your memory gets significantly worse.
Oh no.
Sustained heavy use may reduce your ability to learn, your reasoning, perception, attention span, decision-making, language abilities, and impulse control.
That's terrible.
Most negative effects seem to go away or at least weaken over time after you quit. But again, we
That's
simply
good.
don't know enough and need more research.
If your brain is totally
Well-
fucked up or not, this is what you don't know.
The evidence is much clearer is that consuming a lot
I think it's getting better when you stop.
of weed is really bad for teenagers on multiple levels. If you start using heavily early, you have many more years to build up potentially negative side effects. Teens who use a lot are much more likely to become addicted to weed. This may just be correlation and weed may not be the underlying cause, but heavy weed users are more likely to perform poorly in school and less likely to finish their education.
It's terrible.
They are, on average, less satisfied with their life and what they've achieved. This may simply be because if your memory and motivation are stunted, you have fewer interesting experiences and forget the ones you do have. and there is strong evidence that teen users are way more likely to develop mental health issues like psychosis, schizophrenia, depression, or anxiety later in life. Once again, the younger you start, the higher the risk, and it also seems to rise massively with high THC doses, making highly potent cannabis products even more dangerous for teens. Okay, let's wrap this up. We've only focused on the negative sides in this video. That was the whole point. As we said before, for most people, weed in moderation is totally fine and definitely way less harmful.
It's like everything you do in life. If you do something, just do it like not a lot, just a bit.
You do you, we're not your parents. The upside of moderation is also that when you do it, your experience will be more intense and special. But for teens, weed, especially using it regularly or a lot of it, is a bad idea, with potentially life-changing consequences. We know that criminalization did nothing to make this better. We now have a new chance under legalization. It begins with being open and honest about the state of science and acknowledging that weed is one drug among many others. Certainly not the worst one by a long shot, but also problematic for at least 1 to 3 out of 10 people using it. If you really have to try cannabis, there is a time and place, and that's in your 20s. If you're younger, the science is clear. Don't do it.
Who
At
does
least,
it,
not yet.
before 20?
You'll
Like
have plenty of time to
18,
experiment
16?
later. Let's do a different experiment now. With the help of today's sponsor Odoo, Abitations, our latest drop collection has arrived. Order now. We designed these products to do both. The epic illustrations worthy of representing.
Okay, that's it. I think this video is done. If you want the merch, check out his channel. Kurzgesagt.
Kurz gesagt.
Kurz gesagt.